In the spring of 1944, in a makeshift British military hospital near the bombed-out ruins of Caen, France, Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan, an American Army nurse attached to the Allied Medical Corps supporting the D-Day invasion, stood over the bed of Captain James Hartford, a severely wounded B-17 pilot who'd been shot down over Normandy just days after the initial landings. James had suffered catastrophic injuries, shrapnel throughout his body, a collapsed lung, burns that covered nearly 30% of his torso, and every medical calculation said he should have died either in the crash or during the chaotic evacuation from the battlefield. But Margaret had refused to accept that verdict, had fought through 3 emergency surgeries spanning 18 hours, had kept James alive through sheer skill and what her colleagues quietly acknowledged was something more than professional dedication. As James slowly regained consciousness over the following weeks, as Margaret continued monitoring his recovery with an intensity that went beyond normal medical care, something extraordinary developed between the nurse who'd saved his life and the pilot who couldn't remember anything except her face hovering over him during his worst moments. What began as gratitude evolved into the deepest love either had ever experienced. Margaret finding in James the courage and idealism she'd been seeking, James discovering in Margaret the strength and compassion that made survival feel worthwhile. For 3 months in that French hospital, surrounded by death and destruction, they built something beautiful. Then came August 1944, and the Allied breakout from Normandy, and the chaos of rapid advance toward Germany, and the moment when a German artillery barrage struck Margaret's hospital while James was being evacuated to England for continued treatment, killing Margaret instantly and leaving James to survive, physically while carrying the emotional devastation of losing the woman who'd saved his life and stolen his heart. This is their story, a love born in a hospital ward and buried under the ruins of war, proving that sometimes the cruelest thing about survival is living with what you've lost. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories about connections forged in humanity's darkest hours. Tell me, what's your name, soldier? Margaret Sullivan was 27 years old in June 1944, an experienced Army nurse who'd volunteered for overseas service in 1942. She came from a medical family in Boston. Her father was a surgeon, her mother a public health nurse, and Margaret had grown up understanding that healing was both science and calling. She'd completed nursing school just before Pearl Harbor, had immediately joined the Army Nurse Corps, and had spent 2 years working at military hospitals in England preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. By June 1944, Margaret had treated thousands of wounded soldiers, had developed the emotional armor necessary to function in military medicine, had learned to see patients as medical problems rather than as individuals, because getting emotionally invested meant breaking when patients died. She was exceptionally skilled. Her superiors consistently praised her surgical assistance, her calm under pressure, her ability to make critical decisions when doctors weren't immediately available. But the armor was incomplete. Margaret still felt every loss, still remembered faces of soldiers she couldn't save, still carried the weight of knowing that her skills determined who lived and who died. She'd buried her emotions in work, maintained professional distance, avoided anything that might crack the protective shell she'd built around her heart. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944, the massive Allied invasion of Normandy that would liberate Western Europe, but would extract a horrific cost in casualties. Margaret's medical unit was among the first wave of nurses deployed to France, establishing field hospitals just behind the front lines, preparing to receive the inevitable flood of wounded. The casualties were overwhelming. Thousands of men wounded in the first days, overwhelmed medical facilities, surgeons and nurses working 30-hour shifts without rest. Margaret operated in conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian medicine. Field hospitals under canvas, limited supplies, injuries so severe that triage often meant choosing who might be saved and who was beyond help. It was during this chaos, on June the 12th, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, that Captain James Hartford was brought to Margaret's hospital. James was 29 years old, a B-17 pilot with the 8th Air Force who'd flown strategic bombing missions over Germany for nearly a year. He'd survived 23 missions, far more than most bomber crews completed, and had been considered one of the most skilled pilots in his squadron. On June 11th, James's bomber had been providing air support for ground forces advancing inland from the Normandy beaches. When German anti-aircraft fire had torn through the aircraft, James had managed to keep the bomber airborne long enough for most of his crew to bail out. But the aircraft was too damaged to reach England. He'd crash-landed in Allied-controlled territory, been pulled from the wreckage by advancing American infantry, and evacuated to the nearest field hospital, Margaret's unit. His injuries were catastrophic. Shrapnel had penetrated his chest and abdomen, his left lung had collapsed, burns covered much of his torso from the fire that had erupted in the cockpit before the crash. The triage officer had initially marked James as expectant, military medical terminology for patients too severely injured to save given available resources, patients who would receive morphine for pain but no aggressive treatment. Margaret had been working triage when James arrived. She'd looked at his injuries, read the expectant designation, and something in her professional assessment disagreed with the verdict. James was young, strong, his vital signs suggested he was still fighting. She'd made a split-second decision that defied triage protocol. She'd overridden the expectant designation and taken James directly to surgery. The chief surgeon, Major Patterson, had been skeptical. "Lieutenant Sullivan, that patient is expectant for a reason. His injuries are too severe. We need to focus resources on salvageable cases." "He is salvageable," Margaret had insisted. "Sir, I've seen worse injuries survive. He's young, his heart's strong, he's still responsive. Give me 4 hours in surgery and I'll prove it." Patterson, knowing Margaret's track record and respecting her judgment despite the irregular situation, had agreed. Margaret had scrubbed in as lead surgical nurse, and for the next 18 hours, through multiple emergency procedures, through complications that should have been fatal, she'd fought to keep James alive. She'd anticipated the surgeon's needs, made critical suggestions, performed procedures that were technically beyond a nurse's authorized scope, but were necessary because doctors were overwhelmed with other casualties. Margaret had refused to accept failure, had kept James's heart beating through multiple crises, had somehow, through skill and determination and what felt like sheer force of will, kept him alive. When every medical calculation said he should have died. When the final surgery ended and James was stable enough to move to recovery, Margaret had been physically and emotionally exhausted. But she'd felt something she hadn't felt in months of treating casualties: triumph. Pure, uncomplicated triumph at saving a life that should have been lost. Over the following days, as James slowly regained consciousness, Margaret found herself checking on him far more frequently than medical necessity required. She told herself it was professional follow-up, ensuring her emergency work hadn't caused complications. But it was more than that, and she knew it. James fully regained consciousness 5 days after his crash, confused and disoriented. His first clear memory was Margaret's face. This American nurse who'd somehow appeared in his fever dreams, who'd been there every time he surfaced toward consciousness, whose voice had been the anchor keeping him tethered to life when darkness threatened to pull him under. "Welcome back, Captain Hartford," Margaret said, when James's eyes finally focused on her with genuine awareness. "You gave us quite a scare. How do you feel?" "Like I crashed a bomber," James managed to say, his voice hoarse from intubation. "Where am I?" "Field hospital in France, about 15 miles from the Normandy beaches. You've been here 6 days. Your plane went down, But you survived the crash, and we've patched you up as best we could under field conditions." James tried to process this information. 6 days. He remembered the flak hitting his aircraft, remembered keeping it airborne long enough for his crew to bail out, remembered the crash landing. Everything after was fragmented, pain, voices, a recurring image of this nurse's face telling him to keep fighting. "My crew?" James asked, dreading the answer. "7 of them made it out before the crash," Margaret said gently. "They're all accounted for, various injuries, but alive. You saved them by keeping that plane airborne. You should be proud." James felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by awareness of his own condition. His chest was wrapped in bandages. Breathing was painful. Everything hurt. "How bad am I?" "Bad enough that you should have died several times," Margaret said honestly. "But you're stubborn. We've done 3 major surgeries, and you're going to need more treatment once you're stable enough for evacuation to England. But Captain, you're alive. That's what matters." Over the following weeks, as James slowly recovered, Margaret found herself spending more time at his bedside than strict medical duty required. She'd check on him during breaks, would sit and talk when the hospital had quiet moments, found herself looking forward to their conversations in ways that went beyond professional care. James, for his part, was falling in love. The nurse who'd saved his life, who'd refused to give up on him when medical protocol said he was beyond saving, represented everything James had been fighting for. Margaret was competent and compassionate, strong but not hardened. Someone who'd seen the worst of war, but hadn't let it destroy her humanity. They talked about everything during those quiet moments. Margaret told James about growing up in Boston, about choosing nursing, about the 2 years she'd spent preparing for D-Day. James told Margaret about his hometown in Ohio, about learning to fly, about the 23 bombing missions he'd flown before being shot down. "Why'd you save me?" James asked one evening, about 3 weeks into his recovery. "The triage officer marked me expectant." "You overrode that. Why?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because I looked at you and saw someone worth fighting for. Because sometimes medical calculations are wrong. Because—" she paused, searching for honest words. "Because something told me you mattered, that your survival was important in ways beyond just one more casualty saved or lost." "Thank you," James said simply. "For not giving up on me. For fighting when you didn't have to. For, Margaret, I don't know how to adequately express what you've given me." "You can express it by getting better," Margaret said, maintaining professional distance even as her heart accelerated at the way James was looking at her. "By surviving and going home when this war ends and living a good life. That's all the thanks I need." But both of them knew it was more complicated than that. What was developing between them transcended normal nurse-patient relationships, was becoming something neither had planned, but both recognized as significant. By July 1944, James had recovered enough to be ambulatory, to walk around the hospital grounds with assistants, to help where he could with other patients despite his continuing recovery. The Allied breakout from Normandy was accelerating, American forces punching through German defenses, beginning the rapid advance that would liberate France and push toward Germany. Margaret's hospital remained in France, treating the continuing flow of casualties from the breakout operations. James was scheduled for evacuation to England for continued treatment and eventual return to the United States, but the evacuation kept being delayed. First by his medical condition requiring stabilization, then by transportation shortages as military resources prioritized combat operations. Neither James nor Margaret was entirely disappointed by these delays. Each postponement meant more time together, more conversations, more deepening of the connection that had started with Margaret's refusal to let James die. In late July, James finally acknowledged what had been building for weeks. They were sitting outside the hospital one evening, watching the sunset, listening to distant artillery fire that had become background noise. "Margaret," James said carefully, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen without immediately giving me all the professional reasons why what I'm feeling is inappropriate, or just gratitude or wartime intensity." Margaret felt her heart accelerate, but kept her expression neutral. "All right, I'm in love with you," James said simply. "I've been in love with you probably since the first time I was conscious enough to really see you and understand that you'd saved my life. You're the bravest, most compassionate person I've ever met. You make me want to be better, to live up to the second chance you gave me. And I know there are regulations against fraternization. I know you're an officer, and I'm technically still your patient. I know the timing is terrible. But Margaret, I can't leave France without telling you I love you completely. And if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, I need to know before they evacuate me to England and I lose the chance to say this." Margaret felt tears welling up, emotions she'd been suppressing for weeks, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. "James, this is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Getting emotionally involved with a patient, crossing professional boundaries, feeling things I have no business feeling." "That's not an answer to my actual question," James said gently. "Do you feel something for me?" "Because I see how you look at me, Margaret. I see how much time you spend with me beyond what medical care requires. This isn't just in my head. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you feel nothing, and I'll accept that, and we'll maintain professional distance. But please don't lie to yourself or to me." Margaret looked at this man she'd saved, this pilot who'd survived impossible injuries, this person who'd somehow become essential to her despite every professional instinct saying emotional involvement was dangerous. "I do feel something," she admitted quietly. "I've been trying not to, trying to maintain boundaries. But James, you're right. This is more than just nurse and patient. I'm in love with you too. And I have no idea what to do about that." James reached over and took Margaret's hand. "We figure it out. You'll be demobilized eventually when the war ends. I'll be discharged once I'm recovered. We'll both be civilians again, and these regulations won't matter. We just have to survive until then, and trust that what we feel is real enough to survive the wait." "And if you don't survive?" Margaret asked, voicing her deepest fear. "James, you'll be going back to combat eventually. Pilots return to duty. I don't know if I can survive loving you and then losing you." "You won't lose me," James said with more confidence than he felt. "I've already survived the worst this war can throw at me. I'm going home, Margaret, and when I do, I'm taking you with me if you'll come." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that they'd have a future beyond this hospital and this war. "Yes," she said finally. "When you go home, I'll come with you. Somehow, we'll make this work." They kissed then, for the first time, sitting outside a French field hospital as artillery fire rumbled in the distance and the war continued grinding forward. It was tender and desperate, and full of promises neither was entirely sure they could keep. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret and James existed in a bubble of carefully hidden happiness. They maintained professional distance in public, but privately, they'd begun planning a future. Tentative discussions about where they'd live after the war, about the life they'd build together, about marriage and family and all the normal things that war had made seem impossible. Margaret had requested transfer to a rear-area hospital, feeling she could no longer ethically continue treating James given their relationship. The request had been approved for September 1944, and James's evacuation to England was scheduled for late August. They'd have to separate temporarily, but both believed they'd be reunited once Margaret was transferred back to England for rotation home. The plans were concrete enough to feel real. James would complete his recovery in England, would likely be medically discharged given the severity of his injuries. Margaret would finish her tour of duty and be rotated back to the States by early 1945. They'd meet in Boston, where Margaret's family could host James while they made more permanent arrangements. The future felt possible in ways it hadn't before they'd met. Then came August 15, 1944. Allied forces were executing a major offensive, and Margaret's hospital received word they'd be getting a large influx of casualties from the fighting. James's evacuation was moved up by 2 days to clear bed space. He'd be leaving on August 16th rather than August 18th as originally scheduled. They spent August 15th together, stealing whatever moments they could between Margaret's medical duties. James was packed and ready for evacuation, his paperwork processed, everything arranged for his transfer to a hospital ship that would take him across the Channel to England. 2 months, James said that evening, as they sat together one last time. Maybe 3 if the war drags on. Then we're both civilians, and we can stop hiding what we feel. I'll write every day, Margaret promised. And James, thank you, for giving me something to look forward to beyond just surviving this war. You've reminded me why saving lives matters. You saved mine first, James reminded her. Everything that comes after is because you refuse to give up on me. I love you, Margaret. That's not changing, no matter how much distance or time separates us. They parted reluctantly, James heading to the evacuation staging area, Margaret returning to her duties, preparing for the incoming casualties. Neither wanted to make the goodbye dramatic or final. They'd see each other in England in a few weeks, would write constantly, would count down the days until separation ended. The evacuation convoy was scheduled to depart at 0600 on August 16th. Margaret planned to see James off, to have one more moment together before he left. She went to bed late on August 15th, exhausted from preparing for casualties, setting her alarm for 0530 to ensure she could say goodbye. She never got the chance. At 0445 on August 16th, German artillery began a desperate counterattack aimed at disrupting Allied supply lines. The hospital, though marked with red crosses and theoretically protected under Geneva Conventions, was struck by multiple shells, possibly deliberate targeting, possibly just terrible luck in the chaos of warfare. Margaret was in her quarters when the barrage began. She had less than 2 seconds warning, the sound of incoming shells, the beginning of a scream, before a direct hit collapsed the building. James, waiting in the evacuation staging area several hundred yards away, heard the explosions, saw the hospital area erupting in flames and debris, and immediately ran toward the devastation despite being barely recovered from his own injuries. He was screaming Margaret's name, trying to reach the burning wreckage, being held back by military police who wouldn't let evacuees interfere with rescue operations. The artillery barrage lasted 10 minutes. When it finally stopped, Margaret's hospital was largely destroyed. 17 medical personnel were killed, including 3 nurses. Margaret Sullivan was among the dead, killed instantly when the shell penetrated her quarters. James learned of her death 3 hours later, just before his evacuation convoy departed. A chaplain delivered the news gently, offering condolences and information about where Margaret would be buried. James received the news in complete shock, unable to process that the woman he'd been planning a future with just hours earlier was gone. He was evacuated to England as scheduled, spent the next weeks in a state of emotional devastation that worried his doctors more than his physical injuries. James had survived the crash, survived injuries that should have killed him, had fallen in love with the nurse who'd saved his life. And now she was gone, killed by random artillery fire hours before they were supposed to separate temporarily. The unfairness was crushing. They'd had 3 months, had built something real, had been planning a future. And now James would live that future alone, carrying the memory of Margaret and the crushing knowledge that she'd saved his life but hadn't been able to save her own. James Hartford was medically discharged from the Army Air Forces in November 1944. He returned to Ohio, physically recovered but emotionally broken. He tried to resume his pre-war life, but everything felt meaningless without Margaret. He'd survived for her, survived because she'd refused to let him die. And now he had to figure out how to honor that survival when the woman who'd made it worthwhile was gone. James never married. He lived quietly in Ohio for 63 years after Margaret's death, working as a commercial pilot, staying connected with his bomber crew who'd survived the war, attending reunions and memorial services. But anyone who knew James well understood that he'd left part of himself in that French hospital when Margaret died, that he'd spent the rest of his life living with the woman he'd loved for 3 months and lost in an instant. Margaret Sullivan was buried in the Normandy American Cemetery, one of more than 9,000 Americans who died liberating France. Her family received her medals and effects, including letters she'd written about James but hadn't sent yet, documenting the love that had developed between nurse and patient in the summer of 1944. On his 80th birthday in 1995, James Hartford traveled to Normandy for what would be his last visit to Margaret's grave. He stood there for a long time, an elderly man paying respects to a woman who'd died young, remembering 3 months in 1944 when love had flourished in the middle of war. James died in 2007 at age 91. His family found among his effects every letter Margaret had written him, photographs from the hospital in France, and a journal entry from August 16, 1944, written shortly after learning of Margaret's death. "She's gone. Margaret is gone, killed by German artillery hours before I was supposed to leave. We were going to have a future. Marriage, family, a life together. Instead, I get to live with the knowledge that she saved my life, and I couldn't save hers. I don't know how to do this. How to live knowing that every breath I take is because she fought for me, but she's not here to see what I do with the life she gave me. I loved her for 3 months. I'll love her for the rest of my life, however long that is. And I'll try to make that life worthy of her sacrifice, even though nothing I do will ever balance the scales. She saved me, and I couldn't save her. That's the burden I'll carry forever." The story of Margaret Sullivan and James Hartford represents one of war's most devastating patterns. Not the people who die in combat, but those who survive only to lose everything that made survival worthwhile. Margaret had saved James through extraordinary skill and determination. James had fallen in love with the woman who'd given him a second chance at life. For 3 months, they'd built something beautiful in the middle of destruction. And then random artillery fire, not aimed specifically at them, just the chaotic violence of warfare, had destroyed everything in less than a second. Margaret died, never knowing how profoundly she'd impacted James. James survived physically but carried emotional devastation for the rest of his life. Their story also honors the often overlooked sacrifice of military nurses who served in World War II. More than 59,000 Tamaivrins, American nurses, served overseas during the war. 201 of them died from various causes. They worked in conditions as dangerous as frontline combat, saved countless lives, and received far less recognition than their male counterparts. Margaret Sullivan was one of thousands of Army nurses who risked and sometimes gave their lives to heal wounded soldiers. Love born in a hospital ward and buried under the ruins of war. It's a story about the unfairness of survival, about living with loss that seems unbearable, about carrying someone's memory long after they're gone. James lived 63 years after Margaret's death, but in a very real sense, part of him died on August 16, 1944, in that French hospital when artillery fire took the woman he loved. They'd had 3 months. It wasn't enough. It would never have been enough. But it was all the war allowed them before taking Margaret away and leaving James to survive alone, carrying the memory of the nurse who'd saved his life and the love they'd built in the brief window between his crash and her death. Sometimes the cruelest thing about war isn't dying. It's living with what war has taken from you. Breathing every day with the knowledge that someone fought to keep you alive, but isn't here to see what you do with that gift. But this wasn't the only love story destroyed by war's random violence. In our next story, you'll meet Lieutenant Sarah Morrison and Sergeant Thomas Blake, who fell in love during the Battle of the Bulge, survived the war's bloodiest winter offensive together, and were planning their wedding for May 1945, only to have Thomas killed by a sniper's bullet on May 7th, the day before Germany surrendered, leaving Sarah to face peace, knowing that the man she'd survived war with hadn't survived long enough to enjoy the victory they'd fought for.